I called my wife by surprise when she was at her lover's house, and then I said, "I want a divorce now, I know everything and I know where you are," and the silence that followed my warning was the sound of her falling. I hung up peacefully, because in that moment I decided to choose myself. She tried to deny it, then begged, but nothing could erase what I saw and heard. Over time, she discovered that her lover never wanted anything serious, and she was left alone, with the weight of her own choices. I moved on, found a new love with a calm gaze and hands that wouldn't let go of mine. When she sought me out, racked with regret, I offered what I still had left, forgiveness. But I made it clear that I was already with someone else. That's when the penny dropped. A person's downfall rarely happens all at once. It begins with small steps, with avoided words, with averted glances, with silent dinners. It begins when we offer our whole heart and, day after day, receive smaller and smaller pieces back. Betrayal never begins with a stolen kiss, but with a touch that no longer happens, a compliment that becomes a demand, a coldly spoken, "I'm tired." And I saw it all happen right before my eyes. The worst part of it all was that, even though I saw it, I kept loving. Even though I was suspicious, I kept trying. Even though I felt the bitter taste of doubt every day, I kept believing it was just a phase, that we would meet again somewhere along the way, that what we had was strong enough to withstand the silence and distance. But love only endures when it comes from both sides. When it comes from just one, it dies silently, and what remains is a mourning that no one respects. I remember the exact moment I found out. I didn't plan it. It was an impulse, an intuition. I called her for no reason, just to hear her voice. And I heard another sound. Muffled laughter. A male voice. A whisper that said, "Shoo, hang up." In that moment, my world didn't collapse. It froze. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't despair. I just knew. I knew with the certainty of someone who sees, even without seeing. I knew with the dry, raw pain that only betrayal can provoke. And then I spoke. I told her, my voice firm and icy, that I knew everything. That I wanted a divorce. That I knew exactly where she stood. The silence that followed wasn't silence. It was the fall. Her soul plummeting from the pedestal of lies she built. It was the sound of someone who found herself naked before the truth. And I hung up. Because in that moment, finally, I chose me. She tried. She tried to erase what was already a tattoo. She said it was a mistake, a mess, that she felt alone. She blamed me, my schedule, my work, my routine, the children we didn't even have yet. She tried to say it was a moment, that it meant nothing. And I thought about how many times I waited for her at the dinner table, with the food getting cold. How many unanswered texts I sent. How many "I love you's" I received back with a "me too." I thought about all the times she rolled over in bed, without even a good night. It wasn't a moment. It was months. It was choices. It was priorities. And I was no longer one of them. The lover. A pretty face, a few sweet words, and the courage to seize what was broken. But he never saw her whole. He never lived with her through the PMS, the insecurities, the headaches, the silences, the overdue bills. He had the best of her for a short time, and then, simply, disappeared. Maybe she thought he would leave everything for her. Maybe she believed it would be the beginning of a new life. But it wasn't. It was just the end of ours. And the beginning of her loneliness. The irony is that, at first, I suffered. I slept little. I ate less. I tried to understand what I did wrong. I spent nights reviewing our conversations, our photo albums, our moments. I tried to find the exact point where she stopped loving me, but I never did. Because the truth is, sometimes people just choose another path. Without warning. Without justification. And as much as it hurts, it's not our fault. She lost me the day she thought I'd always be there. The day she thought she could change me and then get me back, like someone changing clothes and going back. Time passed. And I was reborn. It was a slow, painful, but liberating process. I learned to sleep in silence, to cook my own food, to listen to music without remembering it. One day, someone smiled at me differently. They looked at me calmly. They touched me as if they weren't in a hurry. And I felt something new. A warmth that wasn't desperate passion, but acceptance. A love without fear. Without games. Without absences. For the first time in years, I felt someone truly saw me. And, most importantly, chose me. Every day. In every gesture. In every detail. With her, I understood that love isn't something we beg for. It's something that happens when two people are willing, and honest. As I walked forward, she remained stuck in the past. She tried to reach out to me. She sent long messages, full of longing and pain. She said she missed me, that time had made her see everything she'd lost. And I believed her. Not that she loved me again. But that, for the first time, she truly understood. But time doesn't come back. What's broken can be forgiven, but it can't go back to how it was. And I was no longer available to be what she wanted, not after everything. I offered forgiveness. Because I'm not the kind of man to hold a grudge. But I made it clear that my life had moved on. And there, in that moment, I saw in her eyes the purest pain anyone can feel, the pain of losing someone you loved, because of you. She tried to move on. But all roads led back to what she destroyed. I later learned, through mutual friends, that she kept our albums, read our old messages, listened to my voice in old videos. But this wasn't love anymore. It was guilt. It was longing for security. For the home she traded for a hotel room. I, on the other hand, was at peace. Not because the pain passed quickly, but because she taught me that self-love is the last line of defense anyone can have. And I chose to protect myself. I chose not to beg for crumbs. I chose not to accept being a plan B. I chose, finally, to live. But there was one night that marked me more than all others. A silent, ordinary, rainy night. I was at home, reading, when I heard a notification on my phone. It was from her. A simple message. "Do you still think about me?" I didn't answer. I stared at the screen for long minutes. And suddenly, I opened the trunk where I kept our memories. I found old letters, yellowed photos, a gift she'd given me on our first Christmas together. And there, at the bottom of the box, I found a playlist. It was the one I'd made for her, at the beginning of it all. The same one she used to listen to when she said I was the love of her life. I put on my headphones, pressed play, and it all came back. The laughter. The trips. The way she played her hair. The taste of her coffee in the morning. Everything. But this time, with a bitter aftertaste. Because now, all of that was just a memory. And there, listening to that playlist in the dark, a tear fell. Not out of longing for her. But out of pity. Because she would never experience that love again. Because I did. I loved. Intensely. I was faithful. Present. True. But she couldn't keep it. And when she finally realized what she'd lost, it was too late. But the cruelest thing about life is that it never tells you which moment will be your last. It doesn't tell you that that hurried kiss was the last sincere one. That silent dinner was your farewell. That warm embrace was your last chance. It simply moves on. And those who didn't know how to appreciate what they had end up living off what could have been. What she doesn't know, or maybe she does, is that, one random morning, alone, she opened that playlist. And as she listened, she cried like never before. She cried with her whole body. Because in that moment, to the sound of our music, she understood. She didn't just lose a husband. She lost a home. She lost a love no one else will ever offer. She lost the only gaze that saw her beyond the masks. And that kind of loss can't be repaired. It can only be carried. But what really happened to her after that? What did she do with that pain, that emptiness, that cruel conscience? Did she chase me? Did she try to win me back? Did she change? Or did she sink even deeper? What happened when silence became her only companion? And, will she ever forget me? Or does she still dream of me in the early hours of the morning when she can't sleep? Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support, never, any kind of betrayal. All the stories you'll hear are fictional, but the feelings are real, because the moral is clear: betrayal destroys, it tears up everything true by the roots, and leaves only regret and loneliness. Now, take a deep breath. Get ready for a shocking story. A story that will make you feel. And remember, some choices are irreversible. Daniel was the kind of man who did things at the right time. He was never impulsive, never needed grand gestures to show his feelings. His way of loving was silent but intense, present in the details, in the care few noticed, in the daily effort to keep everything in order. From a young age, he was driven by a sense of responsibility that seemed greater than himself, as if he already knew that one day someone would depend on his balance to keep from falling apart. When he met Julia, he still didn't know what to expect from life, but somehow, he knew she would change everything. She had a different glow, a way of speaking that mesmerized, a way of touching objects as if the world were made of glass. Julia carried an aura of freedom, an almost unconscious charm, as if unaware of the effect she had on others, and perhaps that was what most attracted him. They met in a small coffee shop, late on a gray day. Daniel was immersed in a spreadsheet on his laptop, and Julia spilled coffee on the table next to him. The incident turned into a conversation, and the conversation turned into laughter. He was an engineer, methodical, reserved. She was a literature professor, passionate about poetry and theater. Two worlds that, at first glance, didn't seem meant to intersect, but they did. In the first few months, it was as if the universe were playing at aligning coincidences, unexpected encounters, shared tastes, a natural fit even in the silences. Julia said he made her feel calm, and Daniel said she brought color to his days. Together, they built a leisurely relationship, based on a trust that, at the time, seemed unshakable. After 2 years of dating, they decided to move in together. They rented an apartment in a quiet neighborhood, decorated with a blend of their styles. The bookshelf was hers, filled with books with marked pages and underlined phrases. The sofa was his, minimalist, practical, gray. The kitchen was shared territory, where he learned recipes to surprise her on Sundays, and she left notes on the cabinet doors with phrases like, "I love you even when you're in a bad mood." There was a sweet routine, full of little rituals that only they understood: drinking wine on Fridays, making pancakes on lazy Saturdays, binge-watching old movies on holidays. Life followed a calm and predictable flow, as if the outside world existed only to remind them that, inside their home, anything was possible. Daniel was consistent, but not cold. He had a way of listening that made Julia feel understood, even when he was making nonsense. He remembered details: the date of their first kiss, the name of her favorite author, the wine she chose on their third date. He gave her flowers for no reason, but never the same ones. He took her car for a service without her asking, left chocolates in her purse when he knew she was having a hard day. Julia, on the other hand, was emotion. She sometimes exaggerated, dreamed big, cried at perfume commercials. But she was generous, intense, and funny. She had a contagious laugh and a spontaneous way of turning any ordinary evening into something memorable. She was the kind of woman who danced alone in the living room and wrote letters by hand in 2020. To Daniel, she was like a book he never tired of rereading, and each page brought something new. The wedding came 3 years later. A simple ceremony, surrounded by close friends, in a garden filled with yellow lights and wooden tables. Daniel cried during the vows. Julia laughed as she wiped his tears. On their honeymoon, they drove through small towns, with no set itinerary, improvised soundtracks, and spontaneous stops to photograph landscapes. They returned with the feeling that life was finally beginning. They bought a larger apartment and began planning for the future: children, travel, stability. He worked hard, but always found time to come home and sit with her, listening to her students, her books, and her worries. She, in turn, became increasingly involved in social projects, endeared herself to her neighbors, organized dinners, and made a point of preserving their emotional bonds. Over time, as is natural, the routine became more demanding. Bills mounted, responsibilities multiplied, and leisure time became more spaced out. Daniel immersed himself even more in his work, taking on major projects and traveling more frequently for work. Julia began filling her days with classes and new courses, striving to keep her creative spark alive. There was still love between them, but there was also silence. A new, dense silence, no longer comfortable. Sometimes it was as if they spoke different languages, even though they shared the same bed. Conversations became objective, practical. The kisses were quick, the hugs hurried. Affection still existed, but it was more functional than emotional. The laughter diminished, dinners as a couple were replaced by lunches in front of the television, and weekends began to be spent in separate rooms. Daniel realized this, but believed it was just a phase. After all, every couple goes through difficult times. He held out hope that things would return to the way they were. He planned surprises, but ended up postponing them out of exhaustion. He considered trips, but unavoidable commitments always arose. When asked, he said everything was fine, perhaps not perfect, but stable. Julia also said she was fine, though sometimes she seemed distant, lost in thoughts he could no longer decipher. They still shared the same space, but they no longer shared the same time. The love that once brought them together now seemed to hold them together by inertia, as if neither knew exactly how to begin leaving, or if they truly wanted to leave. And it was in this silent impasse that their story began to change. The days continued with the same semblance of normality. Daniel continued to wake up early, rush through his coffee, and leave for work with the crooked tie she used to lovingly adjust. Julia still organized the house, tended the plants, and shopped, but now she listened to loud music on her headphones as she walked down the street, as if trying to disconnect from everything around her. Meetings with friends became rarer, visits to family more spaced out. It was as if they had both sunk into parallel bubbles, each facing their own concerns, unsure how or if they should share them. There were still moments of tenderness. She bought his favorite juice, he noticed her haircut, but these gestures no longer held the same luster. They were like memories disguised as routine. The nights were particularly difficult. The silence between them was louder as the world outside fell asleep. Daniel tried to make conversation, tell her something about work, mention a new movie. Julia responded politely, smiled slightly, but quickly withdrew. She said she was tired. That she wanted to read. That she needed to go to bed early. There was a growing but subtle distance. A feeling of something slipping through their fingers, even as their hands still touched. Daniel didn't want to believe this was the end. He wanted to believe it was just a turbulent moment, that it would soon pass. That everything would go back to the way it was before, or at least better than now. He clung to the memories, the good times, the promises exchanged at the altar. Julia, for her part, seemed increasingly oblivious to all of this, as if waiting for something, or someone, that still had no name. Neither of them talked about their feelings. Neither of them faced the issue head-on. Both preferred the comfort of denial, the idea that they were simply tired, busy, overwhelmed. But deep down, something was being lost a little more each day. Admiration gave way to indifference. Care to routine. Desire to habit. They still slept together, but their bodies no longer sought each other with the same urgency. Texts during the day became informative. I love yous became rare. Touch, once instinctive, now seemed a rehearsed gesture. And in that tepid setting, between walls that once held laughter and now held silence, an entire love began to fragment. Not with shouts or fights, but with the worst of weapons, forgetfulness disguised as coexistence. Julia started going out more. She said she needed to breathe, see people, do new things. Daniel supported her. He said it was good, that she deserved it. He trusted her. He always had. Maybe too much. And she started coming back later. Sometimes with plausible excuses, sometimes not so much. He didn't question her. Not out of fear of the answer, but out of pride. Because asking would be admitting something was wrong. And he still wanted to believe everything was okay. He kept doing his part. He came home, made dinner, left the light on. He waited. Always waited. Because this was what love was for him, being available. And he still was. But what Daniel didn't know, what no one knew, was that, in that stillness, something was silently being constructed. A choice, a detour, a failure. And that choice, when revealed, wouldn't just change the course of that story. It would change everything. Because some mistakes can never be undone. And when the truth finally comes to light, the love that once united them will be the same one that will tear them apart forever. Daniel began to notice the signs not all at once, but gradually, as if each small detail were a loose piece of a puzzle he didn't yet realize he was putting together. Julia's replies to his messages took longer, and often came in short bursts, as if responding were a forgotten obligation. Calls were interrupted by vague excuses, and evening appointments became all too frequent. He would say it was fine, that she needed this space, and on the outside he maintained his composure, but inside something was beginning to stir, a discomfort that wasn't yet pain, but was no longer peace. There was a new space between them, and it wasn't just physical, it was as if an invisible glass had formed there, separating two worlds that had previously intertwined naturally. Daniel, though he said nothing, felt something slipping through his fingers. Julia was increasingly absent, and when she was present, she seemed distracted. Her smile was automatic, her attention divided, her eyes darting away from his as if fearing some truth that could not yet be told. She spent more time on her phone, often turning the screen down when he approached, as if a simple glance could expose something she still didn't know how to hide. Daniel, who had always trusted her, began to observe. Not out of immediate distrust, but out of a silent instinct that grew like a shadow. He knew something was wrong, but he didn't want to admit it. He wanted to believe it was fatigue, routine, the weight of adulthood. He preferred to blame himself for not being more present than to consider the possibility that he was being left behind by choice. The dinners he prepared began to be rejected. First because he wasn't hungry, then because of unexpected commitments. She began going out with new colleagues, names he'd never heard, people who suddenly appeared in her routine and who, for some reason, never bothered to introduce themselves. Daniel asked questions lightly, without pressure, simply trying to stay close, but the answers were always vague, accompanied by an impatient tone, as if his concern were a nuisance. He smiled, swallowed his discomfort, and went about his day as if everything were fine. Until one night, when he returned home earlier than usual, he found the house empty, the lights off, and a dirty wine glass in the sink. Julia had said she had a school commitment and would be back late, but when she called the school, she learned there were no meetings scheduled that night. Daniel didn't comment. He just waited. He slept soundlessly, his eyes fixed on the ceiling and his chest tight with silent anxiety. When she arrived, she acted as if nothing was out of place. She said the meeting had run long, that everyone was tired, that she didn't want to bother him with messages. She kissed him on the forehead and went straight to the shower. Daniel just nodded, but that night he knew something was broken. He didn't need proof. He felt it in his skin. In the way she undressed before him without affection, as if fulfilling a formality. In the absence of questions, of curiosity about his day. In the way her touch had become absent, mechanical, as if she were there, but not entirely. He began to pull away too, but not out of revenge. It was an involuntary withdrawal, a protective instinct, like someone realizing they're no longer welcome in their own home. Little by little, Daniel began to notice her schedule, the recurring patterns. Specific days when she left early, more elaborate outfits for supposedly informal meetings, messages typed quickly and then deleted, solitary laughter with her phone in hand. He began to mentally store these details, but still tried to push away the thoughts that gnawed at him. Doubt was a torture worse than the truth. And even without proof, he could no longer look at her without feeling a weight on his chest, as if every gesture held an ulterior motive, a hidden version of reality he couldn't yet access. The nights became quieter, the touches less frequent, and his dreams became invaded by images he didn't want to see, but which seemed to scream inside him. Julia still had the same excuse: meetings, events, co-workers. But he no longer cared about sounding convincing. Lack of explanations had become part of the routine. Daniel, however, didn't confront her. He observed. Silently, he began to form a plan. I needed to know, I needed to be sure. Not for revenge, but so I could finally make a decision. It was as if his life were on hold, as if each day were a wait for the moment when everything would be revealed. Until, one ordinary afternoon, as he was returning home early, he felt an impulse. A sudden urge to call her. He had no clear reason, he just wanted to hear her voice, confirm what his heart had been screaming for weeks. When she answered, her voice sounded nervous, hurried, muffled. He asked where she was, and she said, without hesitation, that she was stuck in traffic after a school event. But in the background, he heard a male laugh, close, intimate, muffled. And soon after, a barely audible whisper, hang up, he'll get suspicious. The silence that followed was absolute. Daniel said nothing for a moment. His hand trembled. His chest burned. The world seemed to have stopped, and all he could hear was his own heart beating, fast, heavy, wounded. Then, with a calm he himself didn't know he possessed, he spoke. He told her he wanted a divorce. That he knew everything. That he knew where she was. And then he hung up. There was no shouting, no accusation. Just the cold realization of a truth that no longer needed to be denied. He stood there, phone still in hand, staring into space. It was at that moment that he felt something unexpected: peace. A strange, melancholic, yet liberating peace. Because now there was no more doubt. Now he no longer needed to wonder where, with whom, why. Now he knew. And with that certainty, he could finally choose himself. Julia tried to return the call. She sent messages. She tried to minimize. Disguise. Deny. But Daniel wouldn't listen. In that moment, he chose silence as his answer. A silence that said everything words couldn't express. It was the end. Not yet official, but definitive. The pain was no longer for her. It was for the story he believed they had. He didn't tell anyone right away. He didn't want to share that pain, not because he was ashamed, but because he wanted to understand for himself what had happened to them. How they got there. How such an intense love could be lost like that, amid routine, neglect, the other's choice. Daniel spent the next few days in a state of torpor. He went to work like a robot, answered his colleagues with monosyllables, avoided worried looks. At home, he avoided the rooms that held memories. The bed, the sofa, even the kitchen. Everything carried the mark of something that no longer existed. Even her scent was still there, like a ghost wandering the empty spaces. Julia, on the other hand, kept trying to contact him. Sometimes guiltily, sometimes coldly, as if trying to justify something she knew deep down was unforgivable. She believed, perhaps, that time would ease the pain, that he would return. But she didn't understand that, for Daniel, love had died the moment he heard that laughter in the background. In that sound, he heard not only the betrayal, but the disrespect, the neglect, the certainty that he was no longer a priority. And there was no coming back from that. No excuse could erase it. While Julia wavered between excuses and pleas for forgiveness, Daniel began to regroup. Not emotionally, he wasn't ready yet, but logistically. He began organizing documents, thinking about moving, mentally structuring the separation. Not because it was easy, but because he knew it was inevitable. She had crossed a line. A line he never thought would exist between them. And now, he was alone with that reality. But there was a part of the story that hadn't yet surfaced. A detail that would transform everything. Something Julia still didn't know how to reveal, or if she should. Because, behind the betrayal, there was something more. A secret. A motive. A decision that, when discovered, would make Daniel question everything again. Including how well he truly knew the woman he loved. Daniel didn't respond to her last messages. He didn't call, didn't respond, didn't seek explanations. Silence was now his defense, his clearest response. Inside him, there was pain, yes, but also a strength he'd never felt before. It was as if he'd freed himself from something without realizing the weight it carried. He no longer cried, nor did he wonder what he'd done wrong. The betrayal, cruel as it had been, had ended a story that no longer held true. He slept little, but he no longer dreamed of her. He ate little, but he no longer felt that lump in his throat. It was as if he were crossing a desert, exhausted, yes, but with the knowledge that on the other side was something new, or, at least, something that didn't hurt. Until, one day, she appeared. She knocked on the door as if she still had the right to. He took his time opening it. He knew that seeing her there would shake something inside him. But he did. She was different. Not dressed up, not provocative. Just, empty. Her eyes were puffy, her shoulders hunched, her face etched with a weariness that didn't seem physical. They hadn't looked at each other in weeks. The silence between them in the hallway seemed to carry the weight of a decade. Daniel leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, expression neutral. She took a deep breath, as if seeking courage from the depths of her own shame, and said she needed to talk. He didn't answer, just made room for her to enter. The apartment was different, with rearranged furniture, changed curtains, misplaced pictures. It was as if he were slowly erasing her footprints from it. Julia walked to the sofa but didn't sit down. She stopped in the middle of the room and began speaking bluntly, as if she'd been rehearsing this moment for a long time. She said she knew he hated her, that she didn't expect forgiveness, but that she needed to tell him the truth because keeping it to herself was destroying what was left of her inside. Daniel remained silent. Not out of indifference, but because now he wanted to hear it through. She said the affair with Lucas, her lover, had begun unpretentiously. That she hadn't expected to feel what she felt. That she'd lost herself in a fantasy. Daniel interrupted firmly, saying he didn't want details of what he already knew. That she could keep the facts, but he wanted the truth she hadn't yet told. It was then that Julia fell silent for a few seconds too long. Her gaze shifted from his, and her hands trembled slightly. When she spoke again, her voice was no longer just guilty. It was frightened. She said she wasn't sure how to tell him, that she didn't know how he would react, but that she needed to tell him, because perhaps it was the only way to end the story with any dignity. She said that, weeks before the discovery, she had started writing in a digital journal at dawn as a way to process her guilt. That she wrote for herself, trying to understand what was happening. But in one of these texts, she mentioned his name, talked about her conflicts, and saved the file on her personal computer. What she didn't know at the time was that Lucas, yes, the same lover, had accessed that file. And that, after their breakup, he would use it in ways she never imagined. Daniel was staring at her now with a slight frown, trying to understand her point. She continued. She said that, after the abrupt breakup with Lucas, she began receiving anonymous messages. First, photos of the two of them together, of intimate moments. Then, screenshots of the messages. And then came the audio messages. Words spoken by her, recorded without her realizing it, at moments when she complained about her marriage, exposed Daniel's private life, talked about her insecurities, the times he cried, the nights he tried to rekindle their relationship. Lucas, after being dumped, spread these audio messages and texts to mutual friends, her family, and even some acquaintances in online groups. She became a joke among those around her. But the worst, according to her, was yet to come. Breathing heavily, Julia recounted how one night, unable to sleep, she put on her headphones and searched for an old playlist to try to distract herself. Unable to understand, he opened a folder with voice files and played one of the audio files. It was Lucas's voice, laughing. And then, what came next was like a punch. He told someone on the other end of the call that it had all been a game. That she was just another challenge. That his real goal was something bigger, to destroy the man she loved, out of pure envy. Because Daniel had turned down a project Lucas had tried to infiltrate years earlier, and had been firmly rejected. He said that, ever since, he'd dreamed of taking something from him. That it was easy to manipulate needy people, that she was emotionally vulnerable, and that it was like stealing candy from a baby. The humiliation was complete. Julia understood, in that instant, that she had been used. That she had betrayed not only the man who loved her, but herself. And all, for someone who never really saw her. Daniel was silent for a long time. Each of her words seemed to resonate within him with more force than expected. The betrayal was in the past. What hurt now was the truth behind it. The motivation. The contempt with which everything had been handled. The image of the other man laughing, mocking, celebrating the destruction of a story built with so much effort. And, above all, the feeling that, for a time, he had been handed over on a silver platter to a stranger who had never respected him. Julia was crying now. A weeping without restraint, without disguise. She said she felt ashamed, that she didn't know how to fix it, that if she could, she would go back in time. But she couldn't. And that was what destroyed her most. Not the fact that she had been abandoned. Not the public humiliation. But the certainty that she had ruined everything for someone who never intended to stay. Daniel stood up slowly, his eyes fixed on her. He walked to the window and stared at the street for a few seconds. He breathed deeply, trying to process everything. When he spoke, his voice was calm, but there was a new bitterness there, a pain that still had no name. He said he hadn't expected to hear that. That, even though the pain of betrayal had already been processed, he hadn't prepared himself to learn that he'd been the target of indirect revenge. He said he felt violated. Not just betrayed. And that, now, he understood why certain silences of hers weighed so heavily. Because she knew, even without confessing, that she had crossed a line from which there was no turning back. Julia tried to move closer, perhaps expecting a hug, a physical apology, an outstretched hand. But he backed away. Not out of hatred. But because, in that moment, all that remained between them was the memory of what they had once been. She asked for forgiveness. She said she deserved nothing, but she needed to try. If she still had a shred of compassion left, she wanted to rebuild. Daniel replied that she would have compassion. Always. But love, trust, partnership, that much she had let slip. And that, even if he tried, he couldn't look at her and not remember everything that had been said, exposed, mocked. That he could no longer lie beside her and not feel watched by eyes that were never there for love. That the place she once occupied no longer existed. Not because he hated her, but because, finally, he had learned to love himself more. Julia left without another word. She carried the weight of regret on her shoulders. But not a regret that leads to redemption. It was the kind of guilt that corrodes, that keeps you awake at night, that resurfaces at the most unexpected moments. Daniel calmly closed the door. He returned to the living room, sat on the sofa, and, for the first time in a long time, cried. But not for her. He cried for himself. For his naivete. For his wasted trust. For the silent pain he'd held for so long. And, most of all, for having believed that love was enough. That night, he understood that love, no matter how strong, doesn't survive when only one side fights to keep it alive. And now, finally, he could move on. Not out of anger, but out of liberation. The days following the confrontation were filled with a silence denser than any Daniel had ever experienced. But this time, it wasn't the silence of doubt or waiting. It was the silence of the end. A real end, not just symbolic. He no longer needed to hypothesize or deal with the anguish of what might be happening behind the closed curtains. Now everything was out in the open. He knew every detail, knew what was said, knew what was exposed, and more than that, he knew there was nothing left to redeem. His name had been ridiculed in the mouth of a stranger, and the intimacy of his home had become a subject of mockery for a man who should never have been allowed access to even a single inch of what had been built with such care. And this, for him, was irretrievable. The words spoken, the leaked audio, the exposed thoughts, every fragment of this silent massacre left its mark. Not physical, but the kind that, no matter how much time persists, never completely fades. Daniel began to change. Not in his gestures or his routine, but in the depth of his thoughts, in the way he began to look at people, in the new filters he installed in his eyes. The naivete he had carried up until that point simply evaporated. The certainties he had about other people's feelings gave way to questions that, though silent, echoed like screams from within. He began to frequent new environments. He changed his routes. He began to avoid places where he might cross paths with memories, with faces too familiar, or even with her. The city seemed different now, as if the maps had been redrawn after the collapse of the world he knew. And amidst this emotional and physical distance, he found, without seeking it, a new point of respite. It was in a small bookstore downtown, on a cloudy day when he just wanted to hide from the noise of the streets. He was walking between the shelves, unfocused, when he accidentally bumped into a woman dropping a red-covered book. She ducked before him, laughing at her own stumble, and when she looked up, he noticed something he hadn't seen in a long time: lightness. Not stunning beauty, nor flashy sensuality, but a calm, a tranquil presence, as if that face said everything without needing to say anything. Her name was Emma. She was simple, direct, and unlike anything he'd known before. She didn't ask invasive questions, didn't engage in conversations that felt like emotional tests. She simply listened. And when she spoke, she did so with a care that seemed all too rare for these times. Emma wasn't in a hurry. Nor was she expecting anything. She was just presence. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel didn't feel the need to protect himself. The encounters became natural. First casual, then arranged, until what was coincidental became frequent. Emma didn't want to intrude. She didn't ask about the past. She said that everyone has their own baggage, and that she just wanted to know who he was now. This disarmed Daniel. Because she offered exactly what he needed: space and sincerity. With her, there were no games. There were no looks that hid ulterior motives. When Emma smiled, it was because she was happy. When she was silent, it was because she respected the timing of things. Daniel began to smile genuinely, even if shyly. To eat with more gusto. To sleep with less weight. Little by little, she occupied a place that wasn't one of replacement, but of reconstruction. He wasn't erasing the past. He was, for the first time, allowing himself to live a new present. Meanwhile, Julia was spiraling into an emotional breakdown that was gradually becoming public knowledge. Mutual friends began commenting on her withdrawal, her absences from meetings, her haggard expression, her isolation. It became known that she had tried to contact Daniel's family, offering letters, explanations, and justifications. But no one wanted to be a bridge anymore. The cycle had ended. What she feared most now was what had previously seemed unthinkable: indifference. There were no more shouts, accusations, or promises of forgiveness. There was only silence. The same silence she had cultivated so deeply within the relationship, now returned with increased force. One random afternoon, Daniel was invited to lunch with a couple of old friends. Arriving at the restaurant, he noticed, without warning, that Julia was there. She had been invited by them, unaware that he would also be coming. The awkwardness in the air was palpable, but Daniel maintained his composure. He sat down, chatted lightly, and avoided any reference to the past. Julia, on the other hand, couldn't hide her tension. At one point, when they had been alone for a few minutes, she approached and told him he was different. Lighter. More whole. Daniel smiled, thanked her, and simply said, "I'm being well taken care of." The phrase, spoken with tenderness and firmness, struck Julia like a blade. Because she knew what it meant. And, for the first time, she understood clearly that he had moved on. In the following days, she tried to contact him again. Not insistently, but with the fragility of someone who realizes they no longer have space. A message. Then, a request to talk. Daniel responded politely but firmly. He said he held no grudges, that he wanted her to rebuild, but that there was nothing left between them to revive. He said he'd learned a lot, especially about the value of silence and loyalty. Julia read the message and, according to those close to her, cried for hours. Not out of wounded pride, nor anger, but because it finally sank in, she destroyed something she could never rebuild. Not just because of the mistake itself, but because of the way it was done, the cowardice of hiding it, the cruelty of the contempt with which she mocked those who had always loved her. Months later, an event brought together many of the people who had been part of the couple's life. It was Julia's sister's wedding, and, ironically, Daniel had also been invited. He hadn't planned on going, but was encouraged by Emma, who always showed respect for his past, without feeling threatened by it. He arrived hand in hand with her, with a serene smile and a confident demeanor. He greeted everyone present, was well received, and didn't shy away from anyone. When Julia saw him, she froze. She was wearing a beautiful dress, her hair neatly styled, but her eyes were downcast, dull, as if she didn't want to be noticed. Seeing Daniel laughing with the others, walking calmly with Emma, she understood that the place that had once been hers was now occupied by someone who would never talk about him behind his back, who would never use his weaknesses as ammunition. When it was time for the waltz, Julia discreetly left. She went to the garden at the back of the ballroom and cried. Not a loud cry, but the kind of cry that seems to come from the soul, as if everything were crumbling inside. She wasn't crying just out of longing. She was crying because, deep down, she always thought he would be there if she ever wanted to return. She was crying because now, even with all the explanations, it no longer mattered. She was crying because she had thrown away the only thing that had ever been true. And worst of all, there was no way to get it back. Julia became a sad memory of a beautiful story she herself chose to destroy. That night, as Daniel left the event, he held Emma's hand tighter. He didn't look back. He didn't even seek out glances. He simply walked forward, with a clear conscience and a peaceful heart. He knew he would still carry scars. But now they no longer hurt. They were just reminders of who he was, and of everything he had to lose to finally find himself. Life, silently, had taken care of giving each person the destiny they chose. And he, after all, chose to be happy. He chose to love without fear. And, above all, he chose to never again accept less than he deserves. The morning after Julia's sister's wedding, the world went on as usual for all the guests, but inside her, there was a silent collapse that showed no signs of dissipating. What was supposed to be a festive day, even if fraught with discomfort, became, for Julia, a cruel mirror of what she had let slip through her fingers. She found herself surrounded by people who, previously, represented affection, and now seemed to orbit her only out of obligation. Her aunt's gazes were no longer the same. Their hugs seemed lukewarm. And what hurt most was the absence of any comment about what she had done with Daniel. No one brought up the subject. Not out of respect, but out of indifference. Julia was beginning to understand the kind of silence that hurts more than a scream, the one that erases you. And in the midst of it all, there was his calm face, his hands clasped with another woman's, the smile she was no longer able to evoke. Daniel, on the other hand, upon waking that morning, felt neither relief nor euphoria. He felt serenity. A tranquility that seemed familiar, but had long since disappeared. It was as if, by seeing her that night, he had closed the final chapter of a story that no longer needed to be read. What Emma offered him was not unbridled passion, nor a cinematic romance. It was something much deeper, the certainty of being seen, heard, and respected. He knew he would never be the same man he was before, nor did he want to be. The wounds he now carries are part of who he has become, and even though they still hurt at specific moments, they served as living reminders of what he would never accept again. There was a time for love, and there was a time to learn to love oneself with the same intensity he once dedicated to those he didn't know how to value. As the weeks passed, the two worlds followed increasingly opposite trajectories. Julia tried to rebuild herself. She sought therapy. She began writing compulsively in notebooks, as if to empty the poison that still gnawed at her chest. She created an anonymous blog where she vented, using fictitious names, trying to make sense of what she had done. But nothing she wrote seemed to be enough to soothe her conscience. Words didn't cleanse. They only organized the mess in a more legible way. She tried dating other people. She tried to distract herself. But every new face was a comparison. Every touch felt awkward. Every attempt to smile felt forced. Because it wasn't about having someone anymore. It was about knowing that the only one who knew her deeply and still chose to stay, was now just a memory, and worse, a happy memory somewhere else. On the other side, Daniel walked a firmer path. Still cautiously, but with decisive steps. Emma didn't pressure him to define their feelings, nor did she demand premature exclusivity. She was a woman who understood that some pains don't disappear with declarations, but with time and truth. Little by little, he allowed her to recognize his scars, but without turning them into walls. Dinners became more enjoyable. Free afternoons were no longer empty. Songs were no longer emotional noises. He was finally able to look someone in the eye without looking away for fear of being broken again. And that, for him, was victory enough. He wasn't seeking revenge, nor was he waiting for the universe to exact its toll. What he wanted now was lightness. And for the first time, that lightness seemed possible. Yet the moral dilemma he carried didn't completely disappear. In moments of profound silence, especially on cold nights when Emma fell asleep beside him, Daniel wondered, should he have done more? Had he somehow failed too? Was there a specific moment when she gave up and he didn't see it? Even though he knew it wasn't his fault, these questions lingered like ghosts. And perhaps that was what made him most human. He didn't stiffen into the role of absolute victim. He knew that relationships are built by two people, and deconstructed as well. He didn't justify the betrayal. Never. But he understood that the cracks began long before the fall. And that he, out of love or fear, didn't look at them in time. This awareness didn't torture him. It simply made him more aware of his own choices. And more careful with Emma. By her side, he learned that being loved isn't about receiving everything all the time, but about feeling that, even on bad days, someone remains. That true love isn't found in grand gestures, but in the constancy of small actions. In the way she waited for him without demands, in the way she listened to him without trying to fix him. He was a different man now. Not just because of the pain he'd experienced, but because of everything he'd learned from her. One afternoon, he received an email from Julia. The title was simple, "Last Thing I Need to Say." He hesitated to open it. He thought for a few seconds, his cursor hovering over the digital envelope. But he clicked. The message wasn't long. It said she had finally understood what she had truly lost. That it wasn't just a relationship, but a man who looked at her the way she had never been able to look at herself. She said she now knew what it meant to be chosen every day, even when she didn't deserve it. And that, because of that, she would never try again. Not out of pride, but out of respect. Because the least she could do was accept that the love he offered was unique, and unrepeatable. And that she, with her own hands, destroyed that miracle. Daniel read the message calmly. He felt no anger. No pity. Just a silent respect for that final gesture. He deleted the email without replying. He knew there was nothing more to say. Sometimes, the best closure is silence. And he had already said everything he needed to when he decided to leave. He no longer felt the need to prove anything, or to explain his feelings. Everything was clear. She understood. He moved on. And that was the only truth left. One ordinary weekend, Emma invited him to visit a nearby town. A simple place, with quiet squares and cafes tucked away among cobblestone streets. Daniel accepted without hesitation. During the trip, they chatted about trivialities, laughed over old stories, and stopped to watch the sunset. And there, sitting beside her, his eyes fixed on the horizon, he felt something rare, fulfillment. Not the euphoria of new love, nor the relief of someone who has escaped tragedy. It was more subtle. Deeper. It was the feeling of being where he was meant to be. Of finally belonging to himself. Emma rested her head on his shoulder and said, in a barely audible tone, that she had learned not to expect anything from others, but with him, it was different. Because he made everything feel safe. Daniel looked at her for a few seconds, gently touched her hand, and replied that security was what he most needed to offer right now. Because after everything, all he wanted was to protect what was true. Not out of fear of losing it, but out of gratitude for having found it. Julia, far from all this, began to walk alone. She no longer sought a new beginning with anyone. She told her friends she needed time to understand herself. She began attending book fairs, volunteering, and a small neighborhood library. There, she hid from the world that knew her. She no longer had an active social media account. She stopped publishing. She was mourning herself. Not for Daniel, but for the woman she destroyed. Sometimes, when the sun shone brightly through the library window, she would close her eyes for a few seconds and remember his laugh. And in those brief moments, she allowed herself to feel. Not the pain of loss. But the taste of what was good. Because, despite everything, for a time, she was loved. And that, even amidst the rubble, still had some value. But there was something Julia didn't know, and would soon discover. Something life held as a final mirror. Not a punishment, but a reflection. Because love, when it's real, doesn't return. It moves on. But the consequences, sometimes they arrive after forgiveness. And they clearly show the price of the choices we make. One of the most unexpected mornings of Daniel's life began with an invitation. It was nothing formal, nothing planned, but it came from Emma with a curious look and a restrained, almost complicit smile. She had bought 2 tickets to a lecture on human relationships and emotional reconnection. The kind of thing he, until recently, would never have imagined attending. But something about her made him accept invitations like this without hesitation. It wasn't about the event itself, it was about the way she enveloped him in the simple, the uncomplicated, as if wordlessly saying that there, by her side, life could be light again. They went. They sat in the back seats, as if avoiding attention. And during the lecture, between cliched phrases and profound reflections, a question from the speaker echoed within Daniel with brutal force: how many times did you have to lose everything to finally see yourself? That stayed with him. Like a thread that is pulled and never stops unraveling the old fabric of a story that he thought he had already sewn back together. On the way out, walking through the quiet streets, Emma noticed he was quieter than usual. She asked if something had bothered him. Daniel denied it with a small smile, but after a few steps, he stopped, turned to her, and said, in a low, sincere tone, "I would never have found myself again if I hadn't been destroyed." Emma didn't respond with words. She simply held his hand tightly, as if understanding the weight of what had been said and respecting the silence that followed. And in that gesture, Daniel understood that not all pain needs to be narrated. Some dissolve in the right presence. There was no need to explain everything that had hurt. Emma didn't want details of the past, but she offered, each day, a new beginning. And that was everything to him. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Julia faced what was perhaps her greatest challenge, the absence of identity. There was no longer any way to pretend she was the same woman she'd always been. The environments she'd once occupied now seemed to reject her. She no longer felt comfortable among her usual friends, and her family avoided mentioning him, as if talking about Daniel would touch a wound she'd created herself. She began walking through the central square every day, always sitting on the same bench near the fountain. She watched the people, the couples, the elderly holding hands, and wondered at what point she stopped believing in what she had. Sometimes she wrote fragments of letters she'd never send. Other times, she scribbled sad poems that ended in ellipses. She was trying to stay afloat, but she knew the emptiness she carried wasn't just from the loss of someone, it was from the loss of herself. She had erased herself in the name of a thoughtless choice, and now she was trying to relearn how to breathe with a chest full of regret. One afternoon, while visiting the bookstore she used to go to with Daniel, she saw on one of the tables a book he had given her years ago. She picked it up, ran her fingers over the cover as if touching something sacred, and remembered the dedication he had written when she gave it to him. To the woman who makes me believe that love can be everyday and yet extraordinary. Remembering those words, she felt like cringing. It wasn't just a memory. It was a silent indictment of everything she had destroyed. In that moment, she understood that losing someone who loved you like that wasn't just losing a love, it was losing the right to be seen by someone with enchanting eyes. And that, she knew, she wouldn't get back. Never again. The following days were filled with small confrontations with memories. A couple laughing at the coffee shop where she used to go with him. A familiar scent on the street. A similar voice in a supermarket aisle. Every detail hurt her differently, because they all carried a version of her that no longer existed. And no matter how hard she tried to rebuild herself, there was a part of her that refused to move on, the part that still waited for him. Not like before, not with the childish hope of reconciliation, but with the heavy regret of someone who missed the chance to do right. Julia had become an observer of her own failure, and that was crueler than any external judgment. Daniel, in turn, began accepting new commitments. He accepted, for example, an invitation to a weekend retreat for people rebuilding their lives after emotional loss. He was encouraged by Emma, who supported him in everything that helped him grow. During this retreat, Daniel didn't talk about Julia. But he did talk about choices. About how it took him years to realize he was offering too much to those who gave too little. He spoke about how, out of love, he kept silent countless times, and how the silence became a suffocating place. This moved the other participants. And at the end, one of the instructors approached and said, "You didn't lose a woman. You freed yourself from a destiny that didn't see you." Daniel smiled and thanked her, but deep down he knew it wasn't about liberation. It was deeper. It was about learning to love with discernment. On the way back, he decided to stop alone at a new cafe, the kind that pops up discreetly in quiet neighborhoods. He ordered a coffee, sat by the window, and watched life go by, unhurried, guilt-free, and untroubled. When he returned home, he found Emma reading on the couch, barefoot, with a cup of tea beside her. Seeing him, she simply smiled. She didn't ask how it was. She simply made room for him to talk if he wanted. Daniel sat beside her, placed his hand on her leg, and said, almost in a whisper, "This is where I want to be." Emma smiled back and simply said, "Then stay." That night had no vows, no promises. But there was shared silence, intertwined hands, and a love that grew slowly, as it should. Unhurried, but with roots. That same night, Julia couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned in bed, her cell phone beside her, unsure why she still had it. They no longer spoke, no longer followed each other, there was no longer any connection between them, except memory. She opened her photo gallery and saw an old one in which Daniel was smiling with his face tilted, as he always did when she said something silly. That expression, that gesture, that image, all of it had been hers. And now it belonged to someone else. For the first time, she cried without trying to hold it back. She cried not because she had been abandoned, but because she knew she deserved to be. She cried because she had waited too long to understand that love isn't eternal when mistreated. She cried because she could no longer look in the mirror without seeing there the woman who betrayed someone who would do anything for her. Time passed. The seasons changed. Daniel and Emma began planning a trip. Nothing grand, just a week away, no itineraries, no plans. Just the two of them and the new they were calmly building. Julia, on the other hand, enrolled in a therapeutic writing course. He began work on a book that might never be published, but which he needed to write. It was called What I Didn't Know How to Take Care Of. On its pages, he poured every fragment of what he destroyed. Not to justify, but to not forget. It was his way of making sense of what remained. Because now he understood, those who betray don't just hurt the other person. They hurt themselves. And this wound, even with time, never completely heals. Daniel hadn't heard about the book. He wouldn't have known. Not because she didn't want to tell him, but because she understood he no longer needed to know anything from her. He had already moved on. He had already chosen. And she was learning to live with the echo of the choices she'd made. Those that, once, had seemed fleeting. But today, carried the weight of an eternity. Daniel and Emma's trip wasn't marked by grandiose landscapes, nor by moments worthy of a perfect photograph. It was marked by the comfortable silence between two bodies that didn't need to prove anything to each other, by the light touch amidst deep conversations, by the ease of sharing a bed without carrying open wounds. With each walk, with each shared meal, Daniel felt more whole. There was no longer a rush to love, but there was an urgency to care. He had discovered that truly loving someone was much more about peace than promises. And with her by his side, everything that once seemed distant now made itself present in small gestures, respect, presence, reciprocity. They returned from the trip more connected, and that same week he made a simple but definitive decision. He donated all the objects that held memories that no longer belonged to him. Old paintings, books marked by another history, photos forgotten in drawers, everything went away. Not with anger, but with the serenity of someone who understands that some doors only truly close when you turn the key with your own hands. Meanwhile, on the other side of a life that never happened, Julia was finishing her book manuscript. The final pages were written with raw, honest pain, like someone pouring out their soul for the last time, trying to somehow organize what was left. As she typed the final words, she didn't cry. She just stared at the screen, motionless, with teary eyes and pursed lips, as if swallowing the last drop of pride. She hadn't sent the book to any publisher. She printed a single copy, bound it with a single sheet of paper, and stored it in a box at the back of her closet, along with some old photos, unsent letters, and a playlist on a flash drive she hadn't yet had the courage to listen to again. Not because she expected anyone to ever read it. But because she needed to end with some kind of tangible record, even if only for herself. The book wasn't about Daniel. It was about the woman she had been, the one she had destroyed, and the one now trying to exist among the pieces. It was an apology that would never be delivered. And perhaps, for that very reason, the most sincere of all. Emma followed Daniel's side with the same lightness she'd entered his life. She didn't demand any major explanations, but for the first time, he wanted to give them all. One ordinary evening, while they were cooking together and laughing about a recipe error, he stopped in the middle of the kitchen, looked at her with a firm, serene gaze, and said he didn't know what the future held, but he knew what he wanted to experience now, and that it was with her. Emma didn't react with euphoria, but with the same sweet gaze as always, cupping his face with both hands and replying that she, too, had waited a long time for something that finally made sense. Their relationship wasn't born from a fire, but from a rebuilding. And perhaps that's why every brick placed between them was firm, stable, and necessary. Julia, however, tried as she might to move on, was surprised by something she hadn't expected: public loneliness. Her remaining friends began discreetly avoiding her. Not out of resentment, but out of discomfort. Whenever she spoke of regret, she ended up returning to the same point: the story she'd lost. It became repetitive. Bitter. Some tried to help, others distanced themselves. Her sister, who had once tried to broker a rapprochement, stopped bringing it up after seeing her dwell on a past that clearly wouldn't return. Julia began avoiding events, preferring empty cafes, and spending afternoons walking aimlessly. She tried signing up for dating apps, but deleted the profiles the same day. No one matched her memory. No new name erased the old. It was as if she'd lost not just a man, but the ability to give herself over again. One morning, passing a newsstand, she saw an article in a local magazine titled, "New Beginnings, True Stories of Emotional Overcoming." On the cover was a photo of Daniel with Emma, smiling next to a text about starting over after difficult breakups. The journalist had met them at a community event and was captivated by the way they spoke of each other. Julia didn't buy the magazine. She didn't need to. That image said more than any printed line. It was a portrait of the life she had destroyed, now rebuilt by other hands. And in that moment, something inside her shattered completely. Not out of envy, but because she finally understood that she was no longer part of that narrative. And never would be again. Daniel never knew about Julia's therapy sessions, nor about the hidden book. He didn't need to know. He had already forgiven, not to free her, but to free himself from the poison of anger. Forgiveness didn't erase anything, but it did restore to him the peace of walking weightlessly. With Emma, he learned that he didn't need to be perfect, just true. And it was this truth that sustained their love, which grew slowly but with deep roots. They traveled, but also stayed home. They made plans, but knew how to live in the present. They laughed easily and cried together when something from the past still hurt. And this was love in its purest form: constant presence and shared lightness. A few years later, Daniel was invited to give a talk on overcoming and emotional reconstruction. He accepted with some trepidation, but ended up becoming emotional during the preparation process. Upon taking the stage, in front of dozens of people seeking healing, he said it was never about forgetting, but about transformation. That love, when betrayed, doesn't die immediately. It bleeds for a while, but can be reborn elsewhere, with someone else, if there's the courage to move on. He said that forgiving isn't synonymous with accepting someone back, but with freeing oneself from the cycle of pain. And that betrayal doesn't just destroy the relationship, it destroys memories, respect, admiration. And sometimes, the very identity of the betrayer. In the audience, among those present, a woman with sunken eyes and hair lighter than before watched him attentively. She didn't applaud enthusiastically, nor did she stand out. She simply listened, silently. It was Julia. She had come here without warning anyone, with no intention of contact. She just wanted to hear him one more time. And at the end of the talk, when everyone stood to thank him, she remained seated. She watched him leave the stage hand in hand with Emma, surrounded by people touched by his story. And then she stood, left through the side door, and walked slowly to the street. When she reached the sidewalk, she smiled for the first time in a long time. Not a smile of joy, but of acceptance. That story was no longer hers. And that was okay. Daniel, as he got into the car, commented to Emma that he'd felt something strange during the talk, as if he were being watched by someone from his past. She laughed, saying maybe it was all in his head. But she held his hand firmly and added, "If it was, I'll have seen how much you've rebuilt yourself." He nodded. He no longer needed validation. He no longer needed witnesses. Because true love, when cultivated with care, speaks for itself. And theirs, though discreet, was strong enough to withstand any shadows from the past. And so, life went on. For some, with ease. For others, with the weight of something that can never be undone. Because this is what betrayal is, it doesn't just end a relationship, it tears out the trust, the security, and the love that was once pure. Some wounds don't heal, they become lessons. And the hardest of all is that sometimes there's no going back. When you betray someone you love, you don't just lose them. You lose the right to be part of the story you helped destroy. Now we want to know, what did you think of this story? Have you ever experienced something similar? Tell us in the comments, we want to hear from you. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, subscribe now and turn on notifications. Every week, intense stories like this are published, always with an ending that brings not only impact, but also reflection. And speaking of reflection, take this with you, betrayal is not a simple mistake. It's a choice that hurts, that rips away the most valuable thing between two people, trust. No matter the reason, no matter the excuse. When someone decides to betray, they're signing the death warrant of something that could have been eternal. Here on this channel, we do not support, justify, or romanticize any kind of betrayal. We believe in true love, mutual respect, and the importance of choosing the same person every day. Because cheating is easy. What's really difficult is honoring what you've built with truth. Until the next story. And remember, those who don't take care of what they have will one day witness someone else living what they lost.